The sun had barely risen over the grand stone mansion when the young maid stepped through the back entrance with her small canvas bag held close to her chest. She always came early, long before anyone else began their day. It gave her a few quiet minutes to gather herself before the noise, the chores, and the constant rush of expectation swallowed her. She preferred the silence of early mornings, when the air felt softer and the world still seemed calm. She moved quietly through the servants' corridor, her steps gentle, her presence barely noticeable. Most people called her the quiet one, because she rarely spoke unless someone asked her something directly. For months she had worked in that mansion, dusting rooms, polishing floors, arranging flowers, and doing anything that needed to be done. She never complained, never argued, and never drew attention to herself. Yet there was something about her that no one could ignore completely. Even though she tried to blend in, she carried a calm softness around her, a feeling of warmth and sadness mixed together. Some of the staff sometimes whispered among themselves, wondering why a girl like her worked so hard for so little. They noticed how she always hummed gentle melodies when she thought no one was listening. It was something she did unconsciously, as natural to her as breathing. One of the older maids once said that the melodies sounded like songs from another life. But the young maid smiled politely and said nothing about it. People often tried to ask her where she learned to hum so beautifully, but she always avoided the question. She wasn't hiding it out of shame. She simply kept that part of her heart closed, like a book she didn't want to open anymore. The mansion itself was huge, decorated with expensive paintings, elegant furniture, and wide halls that echoed with footsteps. It belonged to a proud aristocrat, a man known for his strict standards, sharp tongue, and love of luxury. He believed everything had its place, everyone had a role, and respect was earned, not given. In his world, status mattered more than kindness. He rarely paid attention to the servants unless something went wrong. He treated them with polite distance, as though they were part of the furniture, useful but unimportant. But on that particular morning, he noticed the young maid humming as she wiped the polished edges of the staircase railing. He paused, listening for a moment, confused by the calm beauty of the sound. Then he narrowed his eyes slightly, irritated that a servant would appear so relaxed while working in his home. Without giving it much thought, he dismissed the moment and walked past her, pretending he hadn't noticed. The day moved quickly as preparations began for the evening gathering, an event the aristocrat had been planning for months. Important guests were coming, people who valued art, culture, and high society. The night was meant to showcase elegance, power, and refined taste. The staff rushed around with trays, tablecloths, and flower arrangements. Some were nervous about the aristocrat's high expectations. Others complained quietly about the endless tasks. But the young maid simply continued her work with the same calm presence she always carried. She polished silverware until it sparkled. She arranged white lily in tall vases, trimming the stems with careful hands. She cleaned the corners of the great hall, making sure not a single spot of dust could be seen. All the while, she hummed, softly, unaware that someone else was listening this time. 2 guests had arrived early and were strolling near the hall, sipping afternoon tea. One of them paused, hearing the sound of her humming drifting gently through the air. "Do you hear that?" The guest asked. "The melody is quite lovely." The other laughed lightly. "Probably the maid. I saw her earlier. She looks like the quiet type." The aristocrat overheard their conversation as he entered the room. He forced a polite smile, but irritation sparked inside him. He didn't want his distinguished guests talking about a servant, especially one who did something as simple as humming. "She hums while she works," the guest continued, amused. "Maybe she thinks she's a musician." The aristocrat let out a quick, dismissive laugh, though he didn't find it humorous. A maid with musical talent? I doubt it, he said. She probably just repeats sounds she heard somewhere. The guests chuckled, but one of them raised an eyebrow. Still, the melody was pleasant. It almost sounded trained. The aristocrat didn't like the direction of the conversation. The evening was supposed to be about his grand event, not about servants. So he shrugged and replied, "If she thinks she can impress anyone, maybe I should have her play for us tonight. That might be entertaining." The guests laughed again, assuming he was joking. But the aristocrat wasn't joking. He was annoyed. And when he felt annoyed, he enjoyed turning the attention away from discomfort by making someone else the center of embarrassment. He walked toward the young maid, who was still carefully arranging the last set of flowers. She turned slightly at the sound of footsteps, but quickly lowered her eyes again, unsure why he approached. "You seem to enjoy music," he said with a cool tone. She didn't know how to respond. "I'm sorry if the humming bothered you, sir. I will stop." "Oh no," he said with a smirk. "Please continue. In fact, let's see how confident you really are." She slowly straightened herself, not understanding his meaning. "Tonight," he continued loudly enough for the guests nearby to hear, "you will play a piece on the piano for our gathering." The maid froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers suddenly felt cold. She stared at him, not knowing if she heard him correctly. "Sir? I don't think—" "You do as you're told," he interrupted sharply. "It's just one piece. Surely you can manage that much if you enjoy music so much." The guests watched with amused curiosity. Some of the staff looked on with surprise. A few even pitied her, knowing how intimidating the aristocrat could be. The maid's heart beat rapidly. She felt trapped, unsure of what to do, but she also knew she needed her job. She couldn't risk offending him. She lowered her eyes again and nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." The aristocrat seemed satisfied, waving his hand dismissively as if the matter was settled. He turned back to his guests with a look of smug satisfaction, expecting a moment of entertainment later when she likely stumbled in front of everyone. But after he walked away, the young maid stood there for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly. She pressed them together to steady herself, trying to breathe normally again. One of the older maids approached her with a worried expression. "Child, do you know how to play?" He wasn't serious, was he? The young maid forced a small smile. He was serious. "And I will try." The older maid frowned in concern. "Try? Playing in front of those people isn't something you just try. They expect perfection." The young maid looked down at her hands, the same hands that once moved gracefully across polished keys in another world, a world she had walked away from long ago. She swallowed hard and said softly, "I'll manage." Her answer didn't convince anyone, but she didn't say anything more. She returned to her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the piano in the grand hall. The last time she had sat at a piano, her life had been completely different. Back then, she played for herself, for her family, for the joy of music. Back then, the sound of her playing filled rooms with warmth. Now, she didn't know what would happen when she touched the keys again. Throughout the day, she continued her work, though her heart felt heavier with each passing hour. She could feel the weight of many eyes on her, the curiosity of the staff, the anticipation of the guests, and the sharp expectation of the aristocrat. But underneath all the fear, there was something else, something she had not felt in a long time. A quiet whisper deep inside her chest, telling her that she still remembered, that she still carried the music within her, even if it had been silent for years. As evening approached and the mansion lit up with warm golden lights, she stood alone for a moment in the hallway, calming her breath. She wasn't sure what the night would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. The music she had once loved had never truly left her. And soon, everyone in that grand hall was about to hear it again, The evening arrived faster than anyone expected. As the sky outside the mansion shifted from gold to deep blue, the halls filled with soft lights, delicate perfumes, and the quiet excitement of an event everyone had talked about for weeks. The grand gathering was important for the aristocrat, who prided himself on hosting nights full of elegance and high-class entertainment. He wanted every detail perfect, from the food to the music to the way each candle flickered in the chandeliers. By the time the first guests stepped through the tall double doors, the mansion felt more like a palace. Glittering dresses swayed as women walked into the hall, and polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floors. The air filled with polite laughter and the sound of conversations blending together like a gentle hum. The young maid stayed far from the main crowd, standing behind one of the tall pillars near the back of the room. Her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her, and she kept taking small, quiet breaths as she tried to settle her shaking nerves. She had spent the whole day preparing the house for this event, but the only thing occupying her mind now was the piano that sat under the golden chandelier dot. It shined like it had been polished 100 times. The white keys looked like a row of small moonlit tiles, and the maid couldn't stop staring at them. She remembered touching keys like those once when life was different, when she didn't have to hide who she used to be. She wondered if her hands would remember everything, or if they would freeze under the weight of so many eyes. Guests walked past her, not noticing the fear buried behind her calm expression. Some talked about business. Some talked about fashion. A few mentioned the upcoming performances scheduled for the night violinists, singers, and a young pianist from the city. They spoke about talent like it was a currency that only belonged to their world. The maid listened quietly, but didn't dare join the conversation. She knew her place. A servant didn't speak unless spoken to. Near the center of the room, the aristocrat laughed with two of his closest friends, holding a glass of wine in one hand. His posture was proud, his voice loud enough to make sure others heard him. He loved attention, especially on nights like these. "Tonight will be unforgettable," he said confidently. "Everyone will remember it." One of his friends grinned. "I heard you arranged something unusual. Something about your maid performing?" The aristocrat smirked, pleased that word had spread. "Ah, yes. A little surprise for everyone. She seemed quite confident earlier. Let us see if she can truly play, or if it was all just humming." The friends chuckled, some amused, some curious. They had seen the maid before, always quiet, always working. None of them imagined she could play anything more complicated than a few simple notes. But the idea of a servant performing for an audience made the gathering feel more exciting to them. As the evening continued, more guests arrived, and the hall grew livelier. The musicians hired for the event played soft background pieces while everyone mingled. The maid stayed where she was, watching everything silently. A few other staff members walked past her, their eyes filled with concern. They knew how much pressure the aristocrat had put on her. One of them gently touched her arm and whispered, "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I'll be fine. If you want to back out, maybe you can talk to someone," the staff member suggested softly. The maid shook her head. "It's too late. I have to do it." But deep inside, she wasn't doing it because she feared the aristocrat. She was doing it because she didn't want to let fear rule her anymore. For too long, she had allowed her past to remain silent, hidden under years of hard work and quiet acceptance. Maybe tonight was not the right place, or the right moment, but something inside her whispered that she couldn't run forever. Meanwhile, the aristocrat checked his pocket watch and tapped it lightly with an impatient expression. Where is that young pianist from the city? He should have arrived already. He snapped his fingers toward one of the servants. Find him. But the young pianist was running late due to traffic in the city. something the aristocrat didn't want to hear. Moments later, he turned to the room and said with a voice full of pride, "We'll begin our first performance soon. But before that, I have something unexpected to share with all of you." The murmurs quieted. Heads turned. Glasses paused mid-air. The aristocrat lifted his hand slightly, pointing in the direction of the maid. "One of my staff believes she has a talent for music, and I believe in giving everyone a chance to demonstrate their abilities." His tone sounded generous on the surface, but the tiny curl of his lip revealed something else: mockery. The maid felt the weight of every gaze turned toward her. Her chest tightened, and her breath caught halfway in her throat. She wanted to shrink into the wall, disappear into the shadows. But she couldn't. He walked closer to her, each step echoing in the hall. "Come," he said. "Join us at the piano." The room fell silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. The soft glow from the chandeliers made the piano shine brighter, inviting yet intimidating. She took a slow, shaky step forward, then another, and another. Each footstep felt heavy, like she was walking towards something she couldn't escape. Her hands felt cold, even though the room was warm. Her palms were damp from nerves. But her face remained calm, almost expressionless, something she had learned to maintain over years of working in silence. As she approached the piano, whispers floated through the room. "Is she serious? A maid? This should be interesting." Poor girl. She heard every whisper, but she didn't lift her head. She kept her gaze on the piano bench, the only steady place her eyes could rest. She sat down slowly, adjusting herself just enough to feel balanced. The piano keys were inches away, shining under the warm lights. For a moment, she didn't move. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes softened, and she remembered. She remembered small rooms filled with morning light. She remembered sitting beside someone who encouraged her to play. She remembered applause, not from crowds, but from people who loved her. She remembered the comfort of music, the way it wrapped around her heart like a gentle embrace. Her fingers twitched, as if trying to reconnect with an old friend. The aristocrat leaned against a nearby pillar, crossing his arms, waiting to see her fail. His friends watched intently, their eyebrows raised with curiosity. Some guests leaned forward, almost excited for the moment of embarrassment, but the maid closed her eyes for a brief second. She let the noise of the room fade. She let her heartbeat settle. When she opened her eyes again, she wasn't the quiet maid anymore. She wasn't the girl who hid her past. She wasn't someone afraid of what others thought. She was someone who once knew. Music deeply. Her hands slowly rose to the keys. The room held its breath. She pressed the first note. It was soft, gentle, almost like a whisper. But then came the second note, and the third. And suddenly the melody grew, flowing like water. The notes connected smoothly, beautifully, forming a tune that wrapped around the hall like warm light. The room froze. Guests who had been chatting earlier now stood completely still. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. A waiter carrying a tray paused in shock. No one expected that. Her fingers moved gracefully, confidently. Each movement held years of practice, years she had never spoken about. Her posture changed as she played. She sat taller, her shoulders relaxed, her expression soft but focused. It was as if the piano belonged to her. Several guests exchanged glances, stunned. One whispered, "She's not just good, she's extraordinary." Even the aristocrat's smirk faded slowly. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing not in annoyance, but in disbelief. The melody grew stronger. Her playing became more emotional, more alive. The notes rose and fell like waves, filling every corner of the hall with something the guests had not felt in a long time. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. They danced. The more she played, the more the weight on her chest lifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't working or hiding or running. She was speaking with her music, letting every emotion she had buried rise again. Some guests felt sudden warmth in their chests. Others felt tears gather in their eyes, without understanding why. It wasn't just skill they were hearing. It was heart. The music slowed for a moment, drifting softly like a memory. Then, as if taking a deep breath, it rose into a strong finish, ending on a note that seemed to linger in the air long after she lifted her fingers. Silence. Not the embarrassed silence the aristocrat expected, but the kind of silence that comes after something beautiful, when no one knows what to say. Then slowly, applause. Soft at first, then louder and louder. People stood. Some clapped with both hands. Some simply stared in awe. No one had expected a maid to play like that. The maid sat there for a moment, breathing softly, letting the sound of applause wash over her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply looked at the keys, grateful that her heart had remembered what her mind had forgotten. From the corner of the room, the aristocrat remained silent, his face unreadable. He didn't know it yet, but the night he planned to humiliate her was about to change. More than just the way people saw her. It was about to change him too. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind clung to the air like a soft glow. People were still staring at the maid, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The music she had played echoed in their minds, as if the notes were still floating somewhere above them. Some guests exchanged confused looks. Others whispered quietly, not wanting to disturb the lingering silence that had wrapped itself around the hall. The maid sat still on the piano bench, her hands resting quietly on her lap. She could feel her heartbeat returning to a steady rhythm. She had not expected the audience to react the way they did. For a moment, she felt like she had stepped into a dream, one she had not dared to imagine in years. But as the clapping died down, she became aware of the eyes staring at her. She stood slowly, lowering her gaze, and stepped away from the piano. She wanted to slip back into the shadows where she felt safe, but the warmth of the crowd's eyes followed her. A few guests near the front moved toward her. "Excuse me," one woman said softly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The maid shook her head gently. "I'm just glad you enjoyed it." Her simple answer only deepened the guests' curiosity. Another person stepped forward. "That wasn't just good. That was incredible. You played like someone trained for years." The maid didn't know how to respond. Her fingers touched the side of her dress, gripping it lightly. "I used to practice. A long time ago." Before anyone could ask more, the aristocrat cleared his throat loudly from across the room. His friends stood beside him, but their expressions had shifted. The amusement that had once danced in their eyes was replaced by surprise. Even a touch of discomfort. The aristocrat forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, that was unexpected indeed," he said, trying to regain the attention of his guests. "A pleasant surprise. Let us move on with the evening, shall we?" But the guests were not ready to move on. Something had changed. The maid was no longer just a background figure. She had become the center of curiosity, the topic of interest. A man approached her, a visiting art teacher known for having a sharp eye for talent. "You didn't just practice," he said gently. "Your technique is too polished. You've played for years, haven't you?" The maid hesitated. She looked at him, then at her hands, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want attention. She didn't want pity. She didn't want questions she couldn't answer. She simply said, "It was part of my childhood." The teacher nodded, understanding there was more to her story than she was willing to share. Meanwhile, the aristocrat watched the interaction from a distance. Every whisper about her skill felt like a small crack forming in his confidence. It bothered him that so many people were impressed. It bothered him even more that he had been the one who pushed her onto the stage. He hadn't intended to highlight her talent. He had wanted to amuse his guests by watching her stumble. But instead, she had filled the room with a beauty he couldn't deny. His friends exchanged looks with him. "You didn't know she could play like that?" One of them asked quietly. The aristocrat clenched his jaw. "Of course not. She's a maid. She cleans floors. She doesn't perform." Another friend raised an eyebrow. "Well, she certainly performed tonight." The aristocrat didn't respond. He didn't appreciate the tone. He watched the maid speaking politely with a few guests, avoiding long conversations, but still offering soft replies. That gentle humility irritated him more than if she had bragged. Her calmness made him feel smaller, though he couldn't admit that even to himself. He walked forward, forcing a polite expression. "That will be enough questions, everyone. The maid has work to do. We have other performers arriving shortly." The teacher frowned slightly. "Surely you can give her a moment." Her performance was quite moving. "Of course," the aristocrat said sharply, "but she is a member of the staff. She has duties." The maid lowered her gaze. She knew she had no choice. She didn't want to be the cause of tension. She bowed her head politely to the guests. "Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the evening." The aristocrat stepped aside as she walked past him, but he didn't miss the way some guests followed her with their eyes. He didn't like it. Not at all. As she slipped back into the staff corridor, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Servants looked at her with a mix of amazement and worry. One whispered, "We didn't know you could play like that." Another said, "That was beautiful. But I hope he doesn't get angry." The maid shook her head slightly. "I'm fine." But inside, a quiet fear had already begun to stir. She knew the aristocrat. She knew his pride. She knew he didn't like being overshadowed. She took a moment alone in the narrow hallway and leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath. Her hands were still warm from the piano keys. Her mind still held the melody she had poured her heart into. For a moment, she let herself feel something she hadn't felt in years, a small spark of joy. Then she heard footsteps approaching. The hall was narrow, and the person walking toward her moved with slow, careful steps. It was the older maid who had worried earlier. "Child," she said softly, "what you did out there." It was something else. "I've been here a long time, and I've never seen the guests react like that." The younger maid lowered her eyes. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," the older woman said firmly. "You only reminded the world what beauty sounds like. Not many people can do that." The younger maid's eyes softened. She whispered, "Thank you." But the older maid added with a sigh, "I know his temper. He didn't expect this. Just be careful." The younger maid nodded. She knew the warning was meant with kindness. Soon, she returned to her duties, blending back into the world of quiet footsteps and gentle tasks. But her mind stayed in the grand hall, replaying the moment her fingers danced across the keys. She hadn't expected the music inside her to rise so strongly. She hadn't expected it to reach the hearts of so many strangers. Meanwhile, back in the hall, conversations buzzed with new energy. "Did you hear how she played? I didn't know a maid could have such talent. Did you see the aristocrat's face?" One person whispered with a hint of amusement. People were more impressed by her than anything else that night. Even the fancy decorations and expensive performers felt ordinary compared to what she had done. The aristocrat tried shifting attention back to his event. He encouraged musicians to continue. He invited guests to enjoy refreshments. But every now and then, he caught someone whispering about the maid's performance. It frustrated him deeply. when the young pianist from the city finally arrived. He went straight to the instrument, eager to perform. But when he touched the keys, the audience listened with polite interest, nothing more. His notes were technically perfect, but they lacked the warmth the maid had brought. The difference was obvious. The aristocrat's jaw tightened again. He approached the young pianist afterward and said, "Well done. But perhaps you should have come earlier. You missed the—" Surprise. The pianist looked confused. "I heard people whispering. Did someone else perform?" "A maid," the aristocrat said shortly, as if the word itself tasted unpleasant. The pianist blinked. "A maid? And people are talking about it?" "Unfortunately," the aristocrat muttered. The pianist hesitated. "Was she good?" The aristocrat didn't answer immediately. He turned his head slightly, watching his guests still discussing the moment. Finally, he said stiffly, "It seems they think so." The pianist nodded slowly, sensing the aristocrat's displeasure. As the night continued, people began asking questions about the maid. Where was she from? Was she trained? Why was she working in a mansion instead of performing on a stage? The aristocrat responded curtly each time. "She is staff. That is all." But people were not satisfied with that answer. One guest whispered to another, "Sometimes talent comes from the most unexpected places." Another replied, "Maybe she has a story she hasn't told." The aristocrat overheard those words and felt a strange discomfort settle in his stomach. He didn't like that a servant had become the highlight of his carefully planned evening. After the event ended and the last guest left the mansion, the aristocrat remained in the hall, staring at the piano. The candles were burning down, their flames small and tired. The shadows on the walls moved gently, like they were breathing. He walked slowly toward the piano and touched the polished surface. His reflection stared back at him. He whispered to himself, "How did I not know?" But deep inside, he already knew the answer. He had never bothered to see her. While he stood there, the young maid quietly polished silverware in the kitchen, unaware that her performance had shaken the foundations of the night more deeply than she realized. She simply returned to her simple tasks, trying to hold on to the small warmth that had blossomed inside her. She didn't know that her life was already beginning to change. And the aristocrat didn't know that the emotion he felt stirring inside him was the start of something he had never faced before. Humility. The next morning came with a quiet stillness that seemed unusual for the large house. The maid woke before sunrise, as she always did, but this time her mind was not focused on cleaning duties or the tasks she had to finish. Instead, her thoughts kept drifting back to the night before. She remembered the sound of the piano in the hall, the look on the aristocrat's face, and the way the guests had stared at her like they had seen something impossible. She had not slept much. A part of her wondered if she had dreamt the whole thing, if perhaps her tired mind had played tricks on her. But as she stood in the small staff kitchen and poured a cup of hot tea, she knew it had been real. Her hands had touched the keys. Her music had filled the room, and the people had listened. Still, she felt uneasy. She had no idea what the aristocrat was thinking or what he might say to her next. She feared she might get in trouble for overstepping, even though he had forced her to play. She had heard enough stories from other workers to know that people in power rarely liked being surprised, even if the surprise was a good one. She stepped outside to get some air before starting her chores. The morning breeze was soft, and she could hear birds singing in the trees. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself breathe. It was the only time of day she felt fully calm, but the calm didn't last long. She heard footsteps approaching from behind. When she turned, she saw the house steward coming toward her, walking with his usual urgency. He was a tall man with a serious face, and he always carried a notebook in his hand as if preparing for some important task. "There you are," he said in a low voice. "The master wants to see you right away." Her heart skipped. She tightened her grip on the teacup. "Did he say why?" "No," the steward replied. "But he wants you in the main hall." She knew that tone. It wasn't a request. It was an order. She nodded, placed her cup aside, and followed him through the long hallway. Her steps felt heavier the closer they got to the hall. Part of her hoped the aristocrat would be in a good mood. Another part feared he might scold her in front of others. When she entered the hall, she slowed down. The aristocrat stood near the grand piano with his back to her. He seemed deep in thought, running his hands slowly along the polished surface of the instrument. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked quietly. He did not turn right away. Instead, he spoke while still looking at the piano. "Last night was unexpected." She lowered her head. "If I did anything wrong?" He interrupted, turning toward her at last. His expression was puzzling. Not angry, but not soft either. "You think your playing was wrong?" "I only played because you asked me to," she said. "I didn't want to upset anyone." He walked closer, studying her carefully. "You didn't upset anyone. You surprised them." "You surprised me." She didn't know what to say. He crossed his arms. "How long have you known how to play like that?" She hesitated. "Since I was little. My mother taught me. But I haven't had the chance to play much over the years." He nodded slowly, as if trying to stack her answers in his mind. "You never mentioned it." She shifted her weight nervously. "I didn't think it mattered. I just tried to do my work well." For a moment, the aristocrat didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, filling the room. She felt small under his gaze, unsure of what would happen next. Finally, he walked back to the piano. "Sit," she blinked. "Sir?" "Sit and play," he repeated, tapping the bench. "I want to hear it again. I want to know if last night was real, or if it was just the excitement of the moment." Her heart trembled. She wanted to refuse, not because she didn't love the piano, but because she didn't understand why he wanted this from her now. But she also knew refusing him was not an option. She walked to the bench and sat. When her fingers touched the keys, she felt the familiar spark inside her. She closed her eyes for a brief second, letting her breath settle, then began to play a soft melody she had learned long ago. It was simple at first, gentle like a lullaby. The aristocrat stood behind her, listening closely. Then the melody grew. Her hands moved faster, with more confidence. The room filled with warm notes that bounced gently off the high ceilings and walls. She didn't try to impress him. She simply played with her heart, the way she used to when music was the only thing that made sense in her life. When she finished, she kept her eyes on the keys, waiting for him to speak. "That," he said quietly from behind her, "was not a mistake." She looked up. Confused, he walked around the piano, facing her directly. "Do you understand what people saw last night? Do you know how rare that kind of talent is?" She swallowed, unsure how to respond. "You could have been on any stage you wanted," he continued. "And yet here you are, polishing floors and carrying trays." She felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had never thought of her life in those terms. She had accepted her reality long ago. He studied her again, as if trying to decide something important. "Tonight," he finally said, "I'm hosting another gathering. Smaller than the one yesterday, but the guests will still be people of influence. I want you to play again." Her breath caught. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "But this time, not as a maid. You will be introduced properly." She froze. "Properly?" "You will not stand in the back of the room holding a tray. You will walk to the piano as a performer." Her hands trembled slightly. The thought felt unreal, impossible even. But "What will everyone else think?" she asked. "They will think what I tell them to think," he replied calmly. "And I will tell them the truth, that you have a rare gift." She lowered her gaze. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." He leaned forward slightly. "Last night, you faced a room full of people who expected you to fail. And you didn't break. You didn't even hesitate. Do not pretend you are weaker than you are." She didn't know how to answer. She had never been spoken to like this, not with kindness exactly, but with a strange level of respect. The aristocrat straightened. "You have the day to prepare. The steward will make sure you have something appropriate to wear. Be in the hall by evening." With that, he turned and left the room. The maid remained on the bench, staring at the keys. The room felt different now, heavier with meaning. She touched the keys softly one more time, then stood and backed away slowly. Unsure whether she wanted to smile or hide Dot as the day went on, the staff began whispering. News traveled fast in a house this size. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with confusion. A few seemed upset or jealous, but she tried not to pay attention. She had enough on her mind. The steward led her to a room she had never been in before, arranged with different clothes on racks. He told her to pick something simple but presentable. She touched the fabrics gently, afraid to choose wrong, but eventually she found a dress that felt right, clean, modest, and comfortable. As evening approached, her heartbeat grew louder in her chest. She stood near the entrance to the hall, waiting for the signal to go in. She could hear people talking inside, laughing, enjoying their drinks. The sound made her stomach twist with nerves. Finally, the steward came and nodded. "It's time." She stepped inside. The guests turned to look at her, but this time something was different. There was no mocking, no surprise meant to belittle her. They simply watched, curious. The aristocrat stood near the piano, his expression calm. When she approached, he gestured toward the bench. "Tonight," he announced to the room, "you will hear something special. Something I had the privilege to witness yesterday. Please welcome our performer." She felt every eye on her, but unlike the previous night, she didn't feel like running. She sat on the bench, took a slow breath, and let her fingers find their place on the keys, and then she played. The room fell silent almost instantly. Her music washed over the guests like a warm wave. She didn't try to be perfect. She tried to be honest. Her melodies spoke of her past, her struggles, her dreams, words she had never said out loud. Halfway through the performance, she felt tears behind her eyes, but she stayed strong. She kept playing until the last note faded into the air. When she finally looked up, she saw something she never expected. People were clapping. Not politely, not lightly, but truly, deeply. As if they had witnessed something unforgettable. She saw the aristocrat standing with his arms folded, nodding slowly, almost proudly. For the first time in a long while, she felt something bright growing inside her. Hope. And the night was far from over. She didn't know it yet. But what happened that evening would change everything about her life, her place in the house, how people saw her. And the path she would walk next. The next morning arrived with a softness that felt unusual in a large house. Sunlight slipped gently through the tall windows, warming the floors and giving the rooms a calm glow. But inside the maid's chest, there was nothing calm. Her heart still pulsed with the memory of the previous night, the applause, the surprise on the guests' faces, and the strange expression in the aristocrat's eyes. She had never stood in front of so many people before. She had never played in such a beautiful hall, never worn clothes that made her look like someone from a different kind of life. Even when she woke up, for a moment she didn't know where she was. It took a few seconds to remember that she was still herself, still working in the same house, still the same girl who cleaned floors and washed dishes. But something inside her had changed. as she stepped into the hallway to begin her morning duties. She noticed something strange. People were looking at her differently. Some of the staff offered small smiles. Others stared as if seeing her for the first time. A few kept their distance, whispering quietly to each other. She wasn't sure what those whispers meant: admiration, jealousy, curiosity, or something else. She tried not to pay attention. She had worked here long enough to know that staff gossip could be sharp, and she didn't want trouble. She kept her head down and walked toward the laundry room to begin sorting linens. But before she reached the room, the house steward appeared in front of her again. He held his notebook pressed to his side, wearing his usual serious expression. "The master wants to see you," he said. Her hands froze on the laundry she was carrying. Now? Yes, in his study? The study was a place she had never entered. She had passed by its doors many times, but had never been asked to go inside. Anxiety curled in her stomach as she followed the steward down the corridor. The steward knocked lightly, then opened the door for her. The aristocrat sat behind a large wooden desk, looking over a stack of papers. When she stepped inside, he raised his gaze. "Come in," he said, "and close the door behind you." His tone wasn't harsh, but she still felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. She did as he asked. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I want to talk about last night." She clasped her hands together. "I hope I didn't cause any trouble, sir." "Trouble?" he said, leaning back slightly. "You impressed people I had been trying to impress for years." She blinked, unsure whether he was joking or serious. He continued, "After you played, 2 guests approached me. One of them asked where I had trained you." She shook her head quickly. "I didn't train anywhere. I just learned from my mother." "I know," he said. "But they don't, and they want to hear you again." Her breath caught. "Again?" "Yes, they're attending a charity event next week and asked if I would bring you to perform." The room went silent. She felt her heartbeat in her ears. "But sir," she said carefully, "I'm not a performer. I wouldn't even know how to act at something like that." "You're not just anything," he interrupted softly. "You have a rare talent, and I won't let it stay hidden in this house." His words startled her. This was not the same man who had once ordered her to play just to embarrass her. Something in him had changed, though she didn't know what. He continued, "I won't force you. If you don't want this, you may say so. But if you do, the opportunity is real." She looked down at her worn shoes, torn between fear and a tiny spark of excitement. "How would I even go?" She asked quietly. "I don't have the clothes. I don't have anything." "I will take care of that," he said. "All you need to decide is whether you want to do it." She hesitated, her thoughts spinning fast. She remembered the feeling she had while playing, the freedom, the joy, the sense that her life could be bigger than she ever imagined. She also remembered the applause, the warmth of it. Finally, she lifted her eyes. "Think I want to try." A small, almost invisible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Good, then we begin today." He stood and walked around the desk. "There are things you need to prepare. The event is formal. You will be seated with important guests. You'll need confidence, and you'll need guidance. I'll arrange everything." The maid nodded slowly. Overwhelmed, the aristocrat stepped closer. "Before anything else, I want to hear you play again. Not for the guests, not for the house, just for practice. Meet me in the music room in 1 hour." She nodded again. When she left the study, she stood in the hallway for several seconds, unsure if her legs would move. Everything was happening too fast. Yesterday, she was a maid who kept her head down. Now she was being asked to perform at an event for important people. She took a deep breath and headed toward her room. She needed a moment to clear her mind. As she passed by 2 housemaids, she heard them whisper. "She's lucky," one said. "Lucky?" The other replied. "Or maybe he just feels sorry for her." She kept walking, pretending not to hear. She didn't want to carry their words with her. Not today. 1 hour later, she entered the music room. The aristocrat stood near the piano, waiting. He didn't look impatient, but he did look thoughtful. "Sit," he said gently. She did. "What will you play?" He asked. She paused. "I'm not sure. Something calm, perhaps." "Good. Begin when you're ready." She took a slow breath and placed her fingers on the keys. This time, the room felt different. More private. More intimate. She began playing a slow, emotional piece that her mother used to hum while cooking. The notes were simple, but full of meaning. The aristocrat watched her hands closely, studying the way she moved with the music. He did not interrupt. He did not comment. He simply listened. When she finished, the room felt warm and still. He walked closer. "Your technique is unusual," he said. "Not formal, but very expressive. That is what people respond to." She nodded shyly. "There is one thing you must understand," he continued. "When you step onto a stage, people will form opinions about you before you play a single note. Some will doubt you the moment they see where you come from. But when you play, you cannot let their judgment touch you. You must forget it all." His words surprised her. She didn't expect someone like him to understand what it felt like to be judged. He stepped back. "Again," he said. She played another piece, letting her emotions speak for her. She felt the music flow out naturally, like water finding its path. By the time she finished, she felt lighter. "We'll do this every day," he said. Until the event. Every day after that, the routine continued. She worked her regular duties in the mornings, and after lunch, she practiced in the music room under his observation. Sometimes he gave small suggestions, how to keep her shoulders relaxed, how to let the notes breathe. Other times he simply listened. Slowly, she grew more confident. The nervousness that once controlled her started to fade. As the days went by, the aristocrat began arranging other things. New clothes were delivered. A tailor visited to take her measurements. The steward discussed the schedule with her. Everything felt surreal. One afternoon, after a long practice session, the aristocrat spoke quietly. "You know," he said, "I never expected someone like you to walk into my life and change it." She looked at him, startled. "Change it? I didn't do anything." He smiled faintly. "You showed me something I had forgotten, that talent and dignity can come from anywhere, even from people the world overlooks." His voice carried sincerity she had never heard from him before. She lowered her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "Just keep playing." The week passed faster than she expected. The night of the charity event arrived before she felt fully prepared. A car waited outside the house, elegant and larger than anything she had ridden in. As she stood in front of the mirror, wearing the dress chosen for her, a soft, graceful color that suited her perfectly, she hardly recognized her reflection. The aristocrat appeared at the doorway. He paused for a moment, as though taken by surprise. "You look—" He stopped himself, cleared his throat, then said more formally, "You look ready." She couldn't hide her small, nervous smile. He extended his hand. "Shall we?" She hesitated for a second, then placed her hand in his. As they stepped out of the house together, she felt a strange mixture of fear and hope, two feelings she never thought would live side by side. She did not know what would happen tonight. She did not know how people would react, or whether she would disappoint them. But deep inside, she knew one thing. This night could change her life forever. The car moved gently along the road, carrying the maid and the aristocrat toward the charity event that would shape the next chapter of her life. She sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she tried to steady her breathing. She had never been to a place like this before. She had never even imagined it. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered like distant stars. Everything felt bigger than anything she had ever known. But she reminded herself of something the aristocrat had told her. People might judge her before she touched the piano, but once she played, everything else would disappear. She held onto that thought like a lifeline. The car slowed as they approached the event venue. An elegant building with tall glass doors and warm golden lights shining from inside. Guests in fine clothes stepped out of other cars, laughing and greeting each other as they climbed the steps. The maid's heart fluttered at the sight. She felt terribly out of place. When the car stopped, the aristocrat stepped out first, then offered his hand to her. "Remember," he said softly, "you belong here tonight." She nodded, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. As they walked inside, soft music played in the background, and gentle conversations filled the air. The hall was even more beautiful than she expected. Crystal chandeliers hung above their heads, sparkling with warm light. Long tables were covered in white cloth and decorated with fresh flowers. Some guests recognized the aristocrat and approached him with smiles. But when they noticed the maid beside him, their expressions shifted. Some were confused, others curious. "This must be the young woman you mentioned," one of the guests said with interest. "The one who played at your gathering?" The aristocrat nodded. "Yes, she'll be performing for us tonight." The man smiled at her politely. "We're looking forward to it." The maid lowered her eyes respectfully. "Thank you, sir." With each introduction, her confidence grew just a little. She could feel the aristocrat standing tall beside her, as if silently telling the room that she was someone who deserved to be here. That alone gave her strength. As time passed, more guests filled the hall. Waiters moved between tables with trays of drinks, and the soft chatter of voices blended with light music coming from a small stage on the side of the room. Finally, the event host took the microphone and welcomed everyone. He spoke about the purpose of the charity, thanked the donors, and announced that the night would include a special performance. "Tonight," the host said, "we have someone very unique joining us. A young woman with extraordinary talent, discovered in the most unexpected way. Please welcome our pianist." The room turned toward her. Her breath caught. The aristocrat gave her a small nod. "Go." She walked slowly toward the grand piano at the center of the hall. Her steps felt heavy, but each one carried her closer to a part of herself she had long forgotten. When she reached the bench, she sat down gently. Her hands trembled slightly. The hall grew quiet. She placed her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't in a room full of wealthy guests. She wasn't wearing a borrowed dress. She wasn't a maid. She was a girl sitting beside her mother, learning the first melody she ever loved. With a slow breath, she began to play. The first notes floated through the room like soft raindrops. People leaned forward, surprised by the gentle depth of her tone. As she continued, the melody grew richer, fuller. Her hands moved with confidence she didn't know she had. The music told her story, her struggles, her quiet dreams, the nights she thought life would never change. It carried her pain, but also her hope. And for the first time, she felt truly seen. When she reached the middle of the piece, something shifted inside her. The nerves melted away. Her heart soared. She played not just for the guests, not for the aristocrat, but for herself. When the final note faded into silence, the hall remained quiet for a moment. Then, suddenly, people began clapping loudly, sincerely. She lifted her head, surprised by the warmth in their applause. Many guests stood. Others cheered softly. She felt tears pricking her eyes, but held them back. The aristocrat watched from the side, his expression filled with quiet pride. As she stepped away from the piano, Several guests approached her. "You have a gift," one woman said. "That was beautiful," another added. "Where did you study?" Someone asked. She answered, "Honestly, I didn't study. I learned at home." Their surprise deepened as the crowd talked excitedly about her performance. The aristocrat approached with a calm smile. "You did well," he said. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so nervous. It didn't show." She looked at him gratefully. "I couldn't have done this without your help." He shook his head. "I didn't give you talent. That was already yours. I only gave you a chance." They walked together to a quiet corner as the event continued. She finally allowed herself to breathe. After a while, the event host approached them. "There's someone who would like to meet you," he said to her. She followed him to a table where an older man with gentle eyes sat. He stood when she reached him. "Your performance moved me," he said. "I work with a music foundation. We support young musicians who can't afford formal training. I would like to offer you a place in our program." Her breath stopped. "A place?" she repeated. "Yes," he said. "Full support. Lessons, travel, performance opportunities, everything you would need to grow." She stood still, unable to process his words. The aristocrat stepped forward slightly, also surprised. "That's a generous offer. It's the least we can do," the man said. "Talent like hers deserves a future." The maid felt her throat tighten. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said kindly. She looked at the aristocrat, searching his face. He nodded slowly. "This is your moment. Don't be afraid of it." Her eyes filled with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "I would be honored." The older man smiled warmly. "Then we'll begin arrangements soon." As he walked away, she stood still, amazed. Everything she had dreamed of, everything she thought she would never have, was suddenly possible. That night, after the event ended and the car carried them back home, she sat quietly beside the aristocrat. This time, the silence between them wasn't heavy or uncertain. It was peaceful. "You should be proud," he said softly. "I am," she whispered. "And thank you for believing in me." He looked at her with a gentle seriousness she had never seen before. "I didn't believe in you out of kindness. I believed in you because you earned it." She smiled, touched by his honesty. When they reached the house, she stepped out of the car and looked up at the familiar building. Only this time, it didn't feel like a place she would be trapped in. It felt like a place she had grown from. As she walked to her small room, she thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation that turned into opportunity, the fear that turned into strength, and the unexpected support that came from someone she once thought would never truly see her. The next morning, she woke early again, but this time her heart was light. She stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft colors. For the first time, she felt that her life was no longer shaped by what she lacked. It was shaped by what she could become, and she had become something extraordinary. Soon she would leave the big house behind. She would step into a world she never imagined she would enter. She would learn, grow, perform, and her story would reach people far beyond the walls she had once cleaned. But she would never forget where she came from. She would never forget the nights she practiced alone. And she would never forget the moment music gave her back a future. Her journey was just beginning. And as she placed her hand over her heart, she whispered the truth she finally believed. "I am more than what the world expected."